What happens when one of Hollywood's most unpredictable actors sits across from a journalist who refuses to play by the rules? What began as a typical morning on Good Morning America would spiral into chaos, ending with security storming the set, and Nicolas Cage walking off in one of the most explosive live TV moments ever caught on camera. Before we dive in, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment, because this one gets wild. Behind the scenes, the day began like any other. The GMA green room buzzed with nervous energy. Producers juggling coffees and clipboards, makeup artists adding last-minute touches. Nicolas Cage sat silently in a corner, flipping through handwritten notes, calm, focused, ready. His publicist Miranda paced nearby, quietly repeating herself to a production assistant. He's here to talk about the new film and the veterans' charity. No personal questions. No drama. The assistant nodded. Of course, we've got it all mapped out. But in a private office down the hall, George Stephanopoulos had other plans. George wasn't prepping for a puff piece. In front of him a thick folder. Tabloid headlines, court filings, financial statements. Tax scandals, failed marriages. Wild spending, Nicolas Cage dissected. George flipped through the pages, yellow highlighter in hand. This is the story. This is journalism. His assistant hesitated. Sir, the publicist was very clear. They don't want to go into any of that. George didn't look up. But don't let publicists dictate content. This is Good Morning America, not Access Hollywood. A 20 minutes to airtime. Miranda knocks. She enters to find George still flipping through tabloids. Her eyes narrow. We're sticking to the agreed topics, yes? George barely glances at her. We'll see where the conversation goes. That's not what we discussed. Nicholas is doing you a favor. At least honor the agreement. Now George looks up, his tone icy. Miss Torres, we don't compromise editorial integrity. If Mr. Cage can't handle tough questions, maybe he shouldn't be doing interviews. Miranda's voice stays level. There's a line between journalism and ambush. He's here in good faith, so am I, George says, standing. Now, if you'll excuse me. I have a show to run. Backstage, Miranda finds Nicholas fixing his tie in the mirror. You good? He doesn't flinch, eyes locked on his reflection. Always am. This business teaches you one thing. Adapt or disappear, George seemed. Eager, Miranda warns. Eager how? Before she can answer, a PA appears. Mr. Cage, we're ready for you. The walk to the stage feels longer than usual. Cameras swivel. Lights blaze. At the desk, George wears his usual on-camera grin, but something sharper hides behind it. Nicolas Cage sits, adjusts his mic focused. The countdown begins. Good morning, George says smoothly. Joining us now, Academy Award winner Nicolas Cage. Pleasure to be here, Cage replies evenly. George smiles. Let's talk about the new movie. But first, you've had quite a ride in Hollywood. Some might say a roller coaster. Nicola nods unfazed, peaks and valleys. Part of the job, but George presses in. Your valleys were public. Financial issues, tax problems, a few interesting film choices. The room tightens. Behind the camera, Miranda shifts forward. Nicholas leans back, calm but cooling. I was told we'd focus on the new project and my work with veterans. George barely hears him. We'll get there. But our viewers want you. The real Nicolas Cage. The marriages. The lawsuits. The castles in Europe. And Nicholas pauses. That familiar, simmering intensity creeps into his voice. I think you misunderstood the nature of this interview. George leans in. Come on, Nicholas. You're a public figure. Don't your fans deserve some transparency? The silence hums like static. Then, there's a difference, Cage says, deliberate and cold, between journalism and exploitation. And from there, it only got worse. Right now, Nicholas said coolly, I'm just trying to figure out what kind of interview this is. George's smile flickered. Just for a moment, before returning with forced confidence. He leaned in, mistaking Cage's pushback as an invitation to double down rather than a warning to tread carefully. Exploitation's a strong word, Nicholas. I'm asking what any responsible journalist would ask. Like, how do you reconcile filing for bankruptcy and still buying pyramids, shrunken heads, a private island? Nicholas's jaw clenched. Behind the cameras, Miranda was waving frantically at the control room. George's producer simply smirked, loving the chaos. "Let me stop you right there," Nicholas said, voice dropping into that signature gravel that had launched 1,000 movie trailers. First, never filed for bankruptcy. That's just false. Second, my finances, my purchases, my private life. Not what I agreed to discuss. George flipped his notes theatrically, trying to suggest he had receipts. But when you owe money to the IRS, doesn't that make your spending habits a matter of public interest? I've got documents here that show you spent $200,000 on a rare comic book while under federal tax liens. Nicholas's eyebrows shot up. Documents? Really? What kind of documents? Did you hire a private investigator? Because that would be fascinating. George faltered. They're public court filings. No, George, Nicholas said, voice cutting. Court filings show liens. They don't list specific purchases. So again, where exactly did you get details about my private transactions? George shuffled papers. Less confident now. Our research team is very thorough. Your research team, Nicholas pressed, or your tabloid sources, because it sounds like you've been buying information from people who had no right to sell it. The studio crowd, once entertained, grew uneasy. Whispers started rippling. George tried to redirect. "I think you're deflecting. The issue is, despite your financial troubles, you've continued to live extravagantly." Nicholas's voice rose just slightly. "Extravagantly?" He leaned forward. "Do you know where I was last month?" "George, I was at Walter Reed Medical Center, visiting wounded veterans. No cameras, no press. I spent my own money on gifts for soldiers who gave everything." "But that's not the story you want to tell, is it?" Or George's producer was now signaling hard to cut the segment. George ignored him. "That's admirable," George said. "But it doesn't explain the financial irresponsibility." Nicholas's hands gripped the chair arms. He half rose. "Let me tell you about financial responsibility. I've employed hundreds of people over the years. Crew, assistants, drivers, security, staff. When I take a role, even one you might mock, it puts food on their tables. That's not irresponsibility. That's leadership." George, feeling the ground shift, went for what he thought would be the kill shot. "Let's talk about those roles. The Wicker Man, Ghost Rider's spirit of vengeance. Film's critics called career lows. Were you just taking whatever role you could, for the paycheck?" The question landed like a sucker punch. Nicholas stared at him. The studio went ice cold. "Did you just insult my work?" "I'm asking about your artistic choices?" "No. You're parroting lazy critiques from bloggers who've never stepped foot on a film set. You're quoting noise." "Not in sight." George tried to maintain his posture. Critics and audiences panned those films. Nicholas locked eyes with him. "George, have you ever acted? Ever stood under blinding lights, in desert heat, or freezing rain, trying to breathe a life into a character? Have you ever done 18-hour days to create something people could escape into?" "No," George replied tightly. "But I don't have to be an actor to evaluate a performance." "Actually, you do. At least if you want to judge it fairly. Every role I take, I give everything. Whether it's a blockbuster or an indie film, I commit fully. That's professionalism." George's voice sharpened, but surely some of those choices were driven more by financial necessity than artistic vision. Nicholas leaned in, fire in his eyes. "Let me tell you something about artistic vision, George. Some of the most meaningful roles come from the most unexpected places. Not every film is chasing an Oscar. Real artists don't chase prestige. They chase truth. So financial pressure had nothing to do with it. I'm saying that's none of your business. My motivations, my process, my finances, none of that falls under your amateur analysis." That last word, amateur, landed like a slap. George flinched. Amateur, he repeated, stunned. I've been in journalism longer than you've been making movies. I've interviewed presidents, world leaders, Nobel Prize winners. And yet here you are, Nicholas said, rising fully now, ambushing guests with gossip and half-truths. Tell me, George, when you interviewed those presidents, did you question their Amazon purchases and criticize their career choices? George was rattled. This is different. You're an entertainer. No, I'm an artist. And more importantly, I'm a human being who deserves basic respect. Something you clearly don't understand. The tension was thick enough to slice. Cameras kept rolling. George's producer was now making frantic cut gestures, but George wouldn't let go. Respect is earned, Nicholas. And frankly, some of your behavior has been hard to respect. Silence. A long, awful silence. Then Nicholas stared directly into George's eyes. The same stare that had carried entire films, turned dialogue into daggers. My behavior, he said softly, and the room held its breath. Nicholas's voice was low, almost too quiet, but every word landed like a blade. George, what exactly about my behavior do you find so disrespectful? The fact that I work constantly, that I support charities, that I employ people. Or is it just that I don't fit into your narrow idea of how a celebrity should act? George hesitated. For the first time, real doubt flickered in his eyes, but his pride wouldn't let him back down. Instead, he did what cornered men always do. He doubled down. I think the audience can decide for themselves, Nicholas. The outbursts, the strange interviews, the unconventional lifestyle choices. Unconventional, Nicholas echoed, his voice suddenly sharp. You mean the fact that I care about my work? That I don't give canned answers in press junkets? That I speak like a human being instead of reading from a script? I mean the erratic behavior that's been extensively documented. Nicholas stood up, slowly, fully. The temperature in the studio dropped. The control room froze. Documented by who, George? Tabloids? Paparazzi. Bloggers who get paid to twist ordinary moments into exclusive meltdowns. That's not journalism. That's entertainment cannibalism. George fumbled with his notes, visibly rattled. There are multiple sources of garbage. Nicholas cut in. You want to talk about erratic behavior? Let's talk about yours. You invited me here under false pretenses. You promised a conversation about my work, but instead, you've spent this entire segment trying to publicly humiliate me. I'm doing my job as a journalist. George shot back, his voice rising defensively. No, George. You're being a bully. There's a difference between asking real questions and weaponizing gossip. And you crossed that line 10 minutes ago. The studio was silent, save for the quiet hum of the overhead lights. George's face flushed a deep red. I resent that characterization. I don't care what you resent, Nicholas said. You've spent 20 minutes lobbing half-truths at me like grenades and calling it journalism. That's not reporting. That's a hit job. These are legitimate questions about a public figure, George insisted. Nicholas took a step forward, towering over the desk. His presence swallowed the studio. Legitimate. You haven't asked me a single thing about my craft. Not one question about my new film. Or the veterans I've been working with. Or the real reason I'm here. You've ignored all of it just to chase tabloid heat. The public has a right to know. No. The public has a right to honest journalism. Not this gladiator spectacle you're calling an interview. George tried to regain control, but his voice cracked with strain. If you can't handle tough questions, Nicholas, maybe you shouldn't do interviews. The words echoed across the studio like a challenge no one wanted to hear. Nicholas just stared at him. Calm. Still. Terrifyingly focused. Tough questions, he said, his voice barely above a whisper. Let me ask you a few, George. He leaned in. How does it feel to know your audience just watched you ambush a guest in real time? How does it feel to realize that you just torched your credibility as a journalist? on live television? And how does it feel knowing you won't be remembered for your interviews with world leaders, but for this pathetic, desperate attempt to humiliate someone for ratings? George opened his mouth. Nothing came out. The silence in the studio was deafening. Even the cameras seemed to hum louder. Nicolas Cage didn't raise his voice. He didn't storm or shout. But in that moment, he didn't need to. He had already won. Nicholas's voice rose, not in volume, but in weight. Every word landed with purpose. You want to know about my behavior, George? Here it is. When someone disrespects me, I don't smile and nod. When someone ambushes me, I don't sit back and let it slide. And when someone mistakes me for a pushover, I correct that mistake. George tried to interject, his voice cracking under pressure. Nicholas, maybe we should take a commercial? Oh, now you want a break? Nicholas snapped, leaning forward. After 30 minutes of veiled insults, personal jabs, and half-baked accusations, now you're ready to tap out. He placed both hands on George's desk, his posture calm but commanding. The camera crew didn't dare cut the feed. Every lens was locked on him. You brought me here to talk about my film, about the charity work I've been doing with veterans. Instead, you've tried to drag me through the mud with gossip, tabloid nonsense, and cheap shots. Nicholas, I'm just doing my job, George said, but his voice was barely holding. No, George, your job is to inform, to ask real questions, not to act like a hitman for the entertainment press. Your job is to be a journalist. And today, you failed, spectacularly. Behind the cameras, tension rippled across the set. Security edged forward. Miranda was already on the phone. Nicholas stood tall, his decision final. You know what? I've given you more than enough. I came here in good faith to talk about meaningful work, and you turned it into a circus. George's voice cracked as he realized what was about to happen. Where are you going? Somewhere I'm treated like a person, not a headline, Nicholas replied, unclipping his mic with slow, surgical precision. Somewhere my work is respected, not ridiculed. Where my charity efforts aren't brushed aside for cheap drama. Where I'm not ambushed on national television by a man hiding behind cue cards. A panic bled into George's voice now, desperation creeping in. Wet. Nicholas, let's start over. We can talk about your film. Seriously, Nicholas stopped, turned back, looked him dead in the eyes. Start over, he repeated. George, you don't get to start over. Not after showing everyone exactly who you are. Not after using your platform to tear down rather than understand. The room was frozen. Even the lights seemed dimmer. You had a chance to have a real conversation with someone who's dedicated his life to storytelling, to helping others, to something bigger than himself. And instead, you chose petty. You chose spiteful. You chose unprofessional. A long pause. That's on you. Not on me, and with that, Nicolas Cage turned and walked off the set of Good Morning America, leaving George Stephanopoulos alone in a storm of dead air, awkward silence, and the wreckage of his own making. The cameras captured every second George, stunned, the crew paralyzed, security trailing behind Nicholas as he made his way to the exit, dignified, unshaken, resolute. In the aftermath, George stared at his notes like they might offer redemption. But it was too late. The damage wasn't just done, it was broadcast. The segment would be replayed, analyzed, dissected, not as journalism, but as a public unraveling. So there you have it. The moment Nicolas Cage shattered the illusion of morning TV civility and exposed George Stephanopoulos as a bully disguised as a broadcaster. What do you think George should have done differently? Drop your thoughts below. And don't forget to subscribe for more unfiltered moments just like this.